There is a pattern in history that every empire, every ruling class, every power structure follows without exception. Not most of them, every single one. A pattern built not on freedom, but on control. A pattern that begins with order, grows into dependence, and ends in a system people can never escape. Egypt built it with grain, China built it with paperwork, Britain built it with documents, the Soviet Union built it with internal passports. And today, in 2025, the world is building it again. But this time, it's digital, invisible, and absolute. For centuries, governments used walls, soldiers, laws, and fear. But the modern world doesn't need any of that. It doesn't need chains. It doesn't need prisons. It doesn't need guards. It only needs your data, your identity, your transactions, your movement, your dependence on the digital systems that define modern life. And the terrifying part is this: it doesn't matter where you live. The United States, Europe, China. Every major power is constructing the exact same machine, a global architecture of monitoring, scoring, restricting, and shaping human behavior, not by force but by access, not with violence but with silent denial, a system where compliance opens every door and disobedience closes them all. This isn't a prediction, it's a pattern, repeated for thousands of years, perfected today. And once you understand how every previous control system rose and fell, you'll understand the truth. You're already inside the newest one, and escape isn't part of the design. Every system of control in history follows the same 6-stage sequence. The tools change, the technology evolves, the names are different, but the blueprint never changes. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. It's the same script used by ancient empires, medieval kingdoms, industrial superpowers, and modern governments. And it always begins the same way, with organization disguised as stability. First, they integrate everything, not for control, not at first. Integration always comes packaged as progress. In ancient China, it was the household registry. In Rome, it was the grain list. In Britain, it was the imperial census. Information becomes centralized, standardized, unified. The justification is always identical. We need order. And people agree because order feels safe. Order feels modern, until order becomes the foundation of something darker. Then comes dependence. Once the population accepts integration, the system becomes necessary. In the past, you couldn't get food without being on the list. You couldn't travel. You couldn't own land. You couldn't work. And today, it's the same thing with digital identity, digital banking, digital access. Try living one day without your phone, without your bank app, without your login credentials. Dependence isn't a side effect. It's the point. Once dependence is secure, the system becomes aware. Monitoring begins, quietly at first. In Imperial China, officials tracked movement village by village. The British monitored colonial subjects through travel papers and trade permits. The Soviets tracked everything: residence, employment, rationing, even personal relationships. Today, monitoring happens automatically, passively, invisibly. Trillions of data points harvested every hour, turning every human life into a predictable pattern. But monitoring isn't enough. A system can't control millions until it classifies them, until it assigns labels. In Rome, you were patrician or plebeian. In China, your household rank defined your fate. In the Soviet Union, your loyalty score determined where you lived, studied, or worked. Today, it's credit scores, trust scores, risk profiles, algorithmic reputations. Numbers that decide the opportunities you're allowed to have long before you know they exist. And once classification takes hold, the system gains its real power: enforcement by access. The old world used soldiers. The modern world uses permissions. In the past, you lost food rations. Today, you lose account privileges. In the past, you were forbidden to travel. Today, your digital ID simply stops working at the airport gate. No violence required, only denial. And finally, the last stage, the point of no return, irreversibility. When integration is complete, when dependence is universal, when monitoring is total, when classification is automated, when enforcement is digital, the system no longer needs to threaten you. Escape becomes mathematically impossible, not because you're locked inside, but because every door, every transaction, every pathway out is controlled by the same machine. This is the pattern that governed ancient empires, medieval kingdoms, colonial superpowers, and authoritarian states. The terrifying difference today is that, for the first time in human history, the tools of control have merged. Governments, corporations, banks, algorithms, all building one interconnected system. A system designed not to restrain your body, but to capture your life. Not to punish your actions, but to shape your behavior. Not to cage you physically, but to eliminate the concept of outside. Every empire built a system people couldn't escape. But this time, the system is global. History isn't random. It moves in cycles. And the clearest way to understand the system being built today is to look at the systems that came before it. The ones that ruled millions, lasted centuries, and trapped entire civilizations inside structures so complete that escape wasn't an option. It was a fantasy. The first example is Imperial China, the longest-running control system in human history. More than 2,000 years of continuous bureaucracy, a machine of administration so precise that it tracked every household, every movement, every economic exchange, in an age without electricity or computers. The Chinese emperors didn't rule with armies. They ruled with records. Every family was placed into the hukou, a household registration file that determined where you lived, what you farmed, what you owed, what you could become. You couldn't move to another village without approval. You couldn't change your status. You couldn't escape your family's assigned responsibilities. Your life wasn't yours. It belonged to the registry. China perfected something modern governments only dream of achieving: a population so thoroughly documented that the bureaucracy controlled destiny. And this wasn't surveillance by force. It was surveillance by paperwork, by obligation, by necessity. The system didn't need to chase you. It simply refused to recognize you if you stepped outside its boundaries. If your name wasn't in the records, you didn't exist. No land, no work, no protection, no rights. You were erased not by violence, but by omission. Now move forward 1,000 years to the British Empire, the global superpower of the industrial age, a machine that stretched across continents, governing a quarter of the world's population with a strategy so simple it was genius. Control documentation, and you control the world. Britain didn't need to station soldiers on every street. What it needed was a network of permits, papers, trade approvals, and identity documents that made movement impossible without British authorization. A merchant in India couldn't ship goods without stamped paperwork. A farmer in Africa couldn't travel to a nearby region without passes. A laborer in Hong Kong couldn't work without permits issued by colonial officials. And Britain understood something that modern governments understand even better. When you control identity, you control opportunity. When you control opportunity, you control loyalty. And when you control loyalty, resistance dies before it begins. The British didn't build prisons for rebels. They built bureaucracies that made rebellion mathematically impossible. Every trade route, every job, every port, every transaction ran through British approval. Entire populations lived inside a system where survival depended on compliance. Not because they believed in the empire, but because the empire controlled the paperwork that controlled their lives. And then came the third great example, the most chilling of the modern era, the Soviet Union. A government that perfected internal restriction at a level no previous empire had achieved. The Soviet regime believed that freedom of movement was freedom itself, so they eliminated it. Every citizen had an internal passport, not for travel abroad, but for travel inside their own country. Changing cities required approval. Changing jobs required approval. Sometimes even visiting relatives required approval. The Soviet government tracked residence, employment, food access, education, medical services, all through paper-based control systems that made citizens dependent on the state for every basic function of life. And when the system tightened, it didn't tighten with guns. It tightened with stamps, with signatures, with offices that closed their doors. If you were deemed unreliable, your passport could be marked. You didn't go to jail. You simply ceased to have access. The system didn't need to kill you to destroy you. It only needed to disconnect you. This is the moment where the pattern becomes undeniable. China used the household registry. Britain used imperial documentation. The Soviets used internal passports. Different eras, different continents, different ideologies, but the identical architecture: integration, dependence, monitoring, classification, enforcement, irreversibility. China built the first truly integrated population database controlled by scribes and officials. Britain built the first global compliance network, controlled by administrators and colonial officers. The Soviets built the first modern permission-based society, controlled by party bureaucrats. But all three shared the same outcome. People lived inside a system they could not escape, not because they were weak, because the system was total. And here's the part history students never understand. These systems didn't collapse because citizens escaped them. They collapsed because the central authority weakened. When the Ming dynasty fell, the hukou system broke. When Britain lost its empire, the paperwork lost its power. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the internal passport became meaningless. The people didn't break the system broke itself. Which raises the most important question of the modern age. What happens when the system is digital? What happens when it cannot collapse? What happens when it cannot be erased? Because unlike ancient China, unlike the British Empire, unlike the Soviets, the modern world's control system doesn't rely on paper, on clerks, on stamps, or on human weakness. It relies on code, on infrastructure, on financial rails, on platforms that cannot fall because the entire world runs on them, on databases that update themselves, on networks that never sleep. China's administrators needed to manually track millions. Britain needed officers to enforce documents. The Soviets needed clerks and stamps and signatures. But today's world doesn't need any of that. The surveillance is automatic. The enforcement is digital. The control is silent. And the cage is global. And that is why this time is different. Not because the pattern has changed, but because the tools have evolved. This is the first control system in history that doesn't depend on the rise or fall of a single empire. It doesn't collapse when a government collapses. It doesn't disappear when a state dissolves. It persists because it isn't owned by a nation. It's owned by the world. And if that doesn't terrify you, it should, because every empire built a system you couldn't escape. But none of them had the power to make it permanent. This one does. Here's where the pattern stops being history and becomes reality. Because everything the ancient empires built with scribes, everything the British built with paperwork, everything the Soviets built with internal passports, the modern world has rebuilt with servers, satellites, biometric scanners, financial rails, and algorithms that know you better than you know yourself. For the first time in human history, control isn't limited by distance. It isn't limited by manpower. It isn't limited by territory. It isn't limited by the capacity of bureaucrats. It isn't limited by the fragility of an empire. It's automated, global, permanent. And the terrifying part is that it's landing everywhere at once. Look at China. They built the world's first digital total control grid. The social credit system doesn't just track what you buy. It tracks where you go, what you say, who you talk to, what you like, what you search, how you behave. Millions of cameras, biometric checkpoints, QR permissions. Step into a train station, step into a mall, step into a street. The system knows everything. One wrong move, one wrong circle of friends, one wrong expression online, and your access shuts off. No loans, no travel, no flights, no trains, no future. It's the Soviet internal passport, rebuilt in code. It's the British documentation network, automated at scale. It's the Chinese imperial registry, digitized beyond imagination. And for years, the rest of the world told itself, that's just China. But that illusion didn't last long, because Europe began building its own version. Digital identity programs, mandatory for travel, banking, medical access, government services. One ID for everything. One login for your life. Combine that with cashless infrastructure, behavioral risk scores, and real-time data sharing between government and corporate platforms. And suddenly Europe resembles a cleaned-up, polite version of the same machinery. A system where access can be granted or revoked with a single switch. Then look at the United States, supposedly the freest country on earth, and yet every cell tower tracks you. Every purchase is logged. Every app siphons your information. Every financial transaction is screened. Every airport scans your biometrics. You can't travel, work, study, or even exist in modern society without entering a digital identity maze built by corporations and monitored by government agencies. And here's the truth nobody wants to admit. In America, control isn't centralized in the government. It's centralized in the infrastructure. Apple controls your identity. Google controls your information. Meta controls your relationships. Banks control your access. Data brokers control your profile. The government plugs into all of it. The Soviet Union could only dream of this level of insight. The British Empire could only dream of this level of reach. Ancient China could only dream of this level of obedience. Because the modern system doesn't need to force compliance. It manufactures compliance through dependence. Now look at what's coming next. The world's most powerful governments and corporations are pushing central bank digital currencies, the first form of programmable money in history. Money that can expire, money that can be restricted, money that can be traced, money that can be switched off. This isn't conspiracy. This is openly stated policy. The US, EU, China, India, Japan, all testing CBDCs simultaneously. And here is the most terrifying detail. Programmable money completes the cage. It merges identity with access, with behavior, with survival. If your money can be restricted based on your score, your travel controlled by your profile, your communication filtered by algorithms, your opportunities ranked by unseen systems, then you don't need a dictator. You don't need a police state. The system becomes the dictator. The infrastructure becomes the police. The algorithm becomes the enforcer. And this is the moment where the pattern repeats with horrifying precision. Ancient China restricted movement. Modern China restricts access. Britain controlled trade routes. Modern governments controlled digital ones. The Soviets controlled physical permission. Modern states controlled digital permission. Every empire built a system you couldn't escape. But no empire ever built a system that followed you everywhere. Until now. Because today the system is in your phone, in your wallet, in your apps, in your bank, in your passport, in your identity, in your digital shadow, in the infrastructure of everyday life. And here's the line that finally removes all doubt. We are already living in stage 5, not approaching it, not drifting into it, already inside it. And the last stage, irreversibility, is closer than anyone understands. Not because governments are plotting in secret, but because the world has become addicted to convenience. And convenience is the perfect cage. History shows where this always leads, and it's never freedom. If this pattern continues, and history shows it always continues, then the next 36 months are not a mystery. They are a sequence, a timeline, a set of events already moving toward their conclusion, regardless of who wins elections, who passes laws, or who pretends to be in control. Because once a system reaches stage 5, momentum takes over. And at that point, the collapse of freedom isn't dramatic. It's procedural. Here's the forecast nobody wants to hear. In the next 12 months, digital identity becomes mandatory in multiple regions. Not forced, required for convenience. Airports will shift fully to biometric verification. Banking platforms will quietly connect identity to risk profiling. Your phone will become your passport, your key, your wallet, your ID, not by choice, but by default. And once identity becomes inseparable from daily function, opting out becomes impossible. In the next 18 months, programmable money enters mainstream trials. Governments will sell it as innovation, security against fraud, improved welfare distribution, or climate-conscious consumption. But the truth is simpler. Programmable money creates the first fully controllable financial ecosystem in human history. If money can be limited by category, by location, by time, then money stops being money. It becomes obedience. Expect to see pilot regions, test cities, and voluntary adoption phases. But history tells us that voluntary phases always become mandatory phases, because the system can't function without participation. And once participation becomes universal, control becomes effortless. In the next 24 months, restrictions will begin merging. Travel will connect to identity. Identity will connect to finances. Finances will connect to behavior. Behavior will connect to access. Each step justified by safety, efficiency, and convenience. No dramatic laws, no national speeches, just a steady tightening, one integration at a time. This is how every system in history expanded, not through a single event, through accumulation. Small steps that feel harmless until you realize they form a cage. By the 36-month mark, the world enters the final phase. irreversibility, the point where the infrastructure becomes so central to daily life, so embedded in economic survival, that no population can function outside it. No underground economy, no alternative identity, no parallel system. The infrastructure becomes the world. What does irreversibility look like? It looks like banks fully abandoning physical branches. It looks like governments accepting only digital verification. It looks like transportation requiring digital clearance. It looks like offline life becoming economically impossible. It looks like individuals becoming functionally invisible if they disconnect. And here's the most chilling part. Irreversibility doesn't require tyranny. It only requires adoption. You don't need a dictator to lose freedom. You only need dependency. And modern society is already more dependent than any civilization in history. The Soviets needed police to enforce compliance. The British needed officers. Ancient China needed scribes. The modern world needs none of them. Your phone enforces compliance. Your bank enforces compliance. Your job enforces compliance. The infrastructure enforces compliance automatically. If this pattern continues, the final stage arrives not with violence, but with quiet acceptance. People won't fight it. People will welcome it, because the system will feel normal, natural, inevitable. And that's the most dangerous moment of all. When control becomes invisible, resistance becomes impossible. You need to understand something most people will never realize until it's too late. This system wasn't built to empower you. It wasn't built to protect you. It wasn't built to give you convenience, security, or efficiency. Those are the marketing terms, the illusions, the wrapping paper. The truth is simpler and darker. It was built to contain you. And once you see the pattern, once you understand the sequence, once you recognize the shape of the cage forming around you, you can't pretend you don't know. History has shown this exact model rise and collapse across empires for thousands of years. Every time people believed they were free. Every time they believed the system worked for them. Every time they believed they had nothing to worry about. And every time they were wrong. Because systems of control don't appear suddenly. They appear gradually. They appear as tools, as innovations, as conveniences. And then one morning, decades later, the population wakes up and realizes they're living inside a structure that controls everything they do. And there's no way out. You are standing in that moment right now. Not next year, not in 10 years, right now. And the people who fail to recognize it will become the same thing every controlled population becomes. Predictable, compliant, and replaceable. Not because they're weak, but because they never understood the rules of the game. This isn't a warning. This isn't speculation. This is a pattern, repeated across civilizations again and again. If you don't prepare, you won't resist. If you don't understand, you won't survive. And if you don't act before the final stage locks in, you will become exactly what the system was designed to create. A citizen who cannot escape,